Now, who doesn't like using trail cameras? I love trail cameras. I've used them since about 1999, when really a big upgrade back then is we'd upgrade to 36 roll exposure instead of 24. And even then, sometimes you get 36 exposures. You couldn't wait. We'd take them to, I think it was Walmart at the time, where we had an hour photo finishing so that you could get them in an hour. I think back in the day, it might have even been we had to wait a day or two to get them back. So use them for a long time. I love them. I think it's a big advantage for you. If you're not using them, you really should be. You really should try them out. And going into 2020 right now, I wanted to talk about, I have all kinds of trail cam strategies. I have a trail cam strategy playlist. It's an important part of everything I do, important part for clients. It's really important because you can learn a lot about your bucks. And it's not just you can shoot them here, not shoot them here. It's about really learning about their behavior, learning about your hunt, how your hunt's doing, how your land's doing, how your habitat management activities are working for you. So a lot of pluses for using a trail camera. You can even learn about your neighbors and when they're on their land and when they're pushing deer. And then you can look and see how they're hunting and learn how they push deer or don't push deer based on those hunting efforts. So a lot of cool stuff. But in this particular case, so I'm talking about, and I'm looking forward, going in through the year right now, really looking at a lot of our buck pictures. And what's interesting is one thing that I find, and this is an overall strategy of this video, is that random is really bad. And what I mean by that is when you find random bucks. I heard someone in the hunting industry say one time that you could expect 50% of your bucks to be random, maybe meaning unknown, that you haven't seen them before. You can't ID them. And folks, if that's the case, either on public or private land, that is bad. That means you're not doing your job. Either it's putting the habitat features together, or you need to scout more and find more defined movements on public land. Because what I find is, random is bad. You should recognize a lot of your bucks and call it the 95% rule, that on your land or where you hunt, you should really recognize about 95% of the bucks. Now, of course, on public land, that'll go down a little bit. But if you have a fairly good trail cam set up on public land, for example, a few years ago, we hunted a particular spot in Ohio. And what was great down there is I found that we put 4 trail cameras out. We had about 6 stand locations spread out over maybe a mile and a half, maybe a mile by mile and a half. It's a pretty big area and very, very hilly. So some on one side of the road, some on the other. We really broke it up. Pretty cool that we found that those bucks overlapped. And we found some of the outside trail cameras. We might have 1 buck on. A middle one, we had a lot of bucks on, a lot of shooters, a lot of bucks that we could identify. But what was really cool about that is by canvassing an area only with 4 trail cameras and putting them on benches, natural saddles, features where deer would naturally move, then we picked up a lot of bucks. And we were able to recognize them. And if we were to hunting that area over and over again and those bucks stayed around in that area, we would have been easily able to recognize a high percentage of the bucks in the area just with those 4 camera locations on public land, let alone if you're on private land and you have highly connected habitat features. Then if you put your cameras out in a location and you're not spooking the deer herd, your habitat features connect, you're doing it right, then you're rarely going to have surprises when bucks come on your land that you haven't seen before. You're going to have a strong representation of the bucks in the local area, and to the tune of the 95% rule, which meaning 95% of the time you're going to recognize those bucks that come on your land. Now, in order to do that, there's a few different key tips that I want to give you, because that is a fact. You should be able to recognize the majority of your bucks, and if not, things are too random. Your cameras have to match the sign, and that seems rather obvious, but I look at a lot of trail cam locations when I'm on client properties. There's some trail cameras. I would say the average, I've seen some excessively high, say 50 on 200 acres or 80, whatever it might be. I would say normally on a 40-acre parcel, I'll see 5 to 8 cameras. And it might be there's a couple of hunting partners and one has 3 or 4, the other one has 2 or 3. But you see about that number. So for that, when I'm scouring someone's woods and scouting, I see a lot of trail cam locations. That's interesting because I'll see some that you look at and think, man, there's no sign here. There's no old rubs. There's no scrapes. Doesn't relate to any habitat improvements. And for that, just in interviewing people, dozens of people a year about their trail cam locations and how does this one working versus that one when I'm on their land, you're just seeing that it doesn't look like a good spot for bucks, and you're not getting a lot of good trail cam photos. And so it seems obvious that your trail cam location should match the sign, but it's not so obvious when I'm looking at trail cams on properties and where they're located and if there's any sign around. And that goes the same for private land and public land. I love finding old sign because a history of old sign where you can tell bucks have rubbed a certain area or certain rubs for years at a time, and there's a collection of rubs. It's a bench, there's rubs, there's old scrapes, there's broken branches. You can tell that it's been a hot spot of running activity for many years. Those are great places for cameras because it's not the current sign that's the most important, it's the history of sign. So if you're matching your trail cameras with the history of sign, then you're going to win. And at the same time, if you're creating habitat improvements that link together, bedding to bedding, bedding to feeding, feeding to feeding, water holes, mock scrapes, where you're really putting that foundation of movement together every day, then obviously you're going to increase the sign in very defined areas. And of course, those end up being great spots for trail cam locations. So again, it should seem obvious, but you have to match your trail cam locations with especially the history of sign. Now, again, the history of sign is one thing, but the reason there's a history of sign, and I'll see this even on big public land tracts. It's pretty crazy. The UP of Michigan, you can walk for a mile or 2 miles sometimes on public land, not find one lick of buck sign. And that could include rubs or scrapes, even giant tracks. You're just not seeing a lot of sign. But that sign connects because of habitat features, whether it's islands out in marshes or points of fingers of highland that goes out into swamps, hardwood cuttings, cut lines, clear cuts. There's always something that sign's going to relate to. And yes, you know, up in there in the UP of Michigan, you might find a nice rub from a nice buck every 100 yards or 200 yards or even up to a quarter mile from each other because those bucks are moving over a great distance. So when I say match it to the sign, you're really matching it to those connections, and then you're verifying with sign, a history of sign, and then you're adding a camera location. So history of sign is one thing, but you're going to find a history of sign by matching up the habitat connections. And it's pretty crazy because when you look at that public land and you match up that connection of habitat features and those lines of habitat feature and how everything comes together, guess what you're trying to do on private land? The reason I do what I do on private land and how I look at it is because I hunted public land long before I hunted quality private land locations where I could count on hunting there, being the only one that's hunting there. I cut my teeth, Pontiac Lake Recreation Area in Lower Michigan, Holly State Recreation Area, and then going up into the UP, I hunted around Engadine, all the way up towards Munising. I started hunting Pennsylvania public land since '93. I've hunted Ohio public land, I think 7 or 8 years in total. So a lot of public land tracks because I couldn't afford to have my own land or lease land. And so I enjoy hunting. I'm going to find land. It doesn't matter where it's at. And it all goes back to following these connections. And you're looking for those spots to put those trail cameras that relate to a history of sign. And on private land, you're just trying to fit everything that you see in these big, giant public land tracts into a 40-acre package, 100-acre package. It's still the same movement. Deer are a lot more compartmentalized on heavily managed, heavily pressured, hunter-pressured, smaller tracts compared to those big, large parcels. A lot of the scientific movement data for mature bucks applies to big public land tracts. In no way does it apply to small public or private lands tracts where those private land tracts have intensely managed habitat, food plots, and locations where there's a lot of hunting pressure, little hidden corners where there's not a lot of hunting pressure. And so you have a big difference in not only the quality of the habitat, but mostly in how hunting pressure is applied. And so you're trying to do the same thing on public land as you are on private land. You're just taking those same features of movement, putting them on private land, and guess what? Doesn't matter if you're putting a camera out in a big, vast public land tract, you're trying to find those connections of habitat features and old history of sign, and then you're doing the same on private land. You're just putting the pieces together, putting the habitat connections together, and the history of sign will follow. You'll have cattle trails, cattle paths in locations where you didn't have it before, and they turn out to be great areas for trail cameras. Now, what you really have to notice when you're looking at your public land, your public or private land trail cam photos, is to make sure a lot of the bucks that I notice or that I see are ones we picked up 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And we just had a handful of pictures of them. And we probably get a handful of pictures of them every single year. And so we're just taking those pictures out of the buck pool where they're actually identifiable bucks. And so for that, we're getting a good collection of unique buck pictures that we can compare from year to year and say, yeah, that's that buck from 2 years ago, or that's that buck from 3 years ago. So very important to keep an inventory of especially your unique bucks, even when they're young, because it's crazy how a 1.5 year old buck, you'll be able to tell the difference from that buck and other bucks when he turns 3.5, even if you didn't have a picture of him at 2.5. The geometry of antlers is so unique to every buck, especially as the type of habitat and quality of soil, nutrients in the soil increases, then you get a lot of unique features in antlers. You see a lot of those areas, the UP of Michigan, Texas, Pennsylvania, the areas, the big hills in Pennsylvania public land, they can be very basic racks. There's not a lot of stickers and kickers and abnormal points, but when you get high nutrition, that brings out those abnormal points, abnormal features, and they're really easy to identify, especially when you get into those ag land areas. So really make a catalog and really pay attention, because it's probably like, you know, about half the bucks that are on this wall right here were what I call non-core bucks. And that's the next point. When you have an assemblage and you're seeing 95% of your bucks, then it's pretty easy to place those bucks in categories of non-core or core bucks. Those non-core bucks that I identify from just a handful of pictures each year, say I've gotten 15 pictures over the last 4 years, those are non-core bucks. They're basically telling you that they're going to show up during the rut, typically during the peak rut only. They're coming over after they've exhausted a couple of does over in their areas they can't find any more in their core areas. So they're ranging out. They're going to come over during good weather, and voila, they come right in your lap. And that's happened a lot. It seems like a needle in a haystack, but they're coming from a mile, 1.5 miles away. They're only going to come over when it's good cruising conditions. They're not going to come when it's unseasonably warm and 30-mile-an-hour winds or bad weather, driving rain, blizzard snow. They're going to come over when the cruising conditions are comfortable. They're only going to come during the peak of the rut, which narrows their movements down to about a 7 to 10 day period. So when you take out the bad days out of that 7 to 10 days, you're left with about 2 days that they might come on your property during the daylight. And for 3 or 4 years, if you've identified those unique bucks, if you've scoured your buck pictures, if you have a good trail cam system and you're connecting habitat features, you're using the history of sign to determine where you place those cameras, then you're going to be able to identify core and non-core bucks. And if you can't identify core and non-core bucks, you need to go back to the drawing board for where you place your cameras, maybe what you're doing with your habitat features, and it goes back to those random pictures that some people get on their trail cameras, when really, you know, it shouldn't be 50% of the bucks that you identify every year. It should be about 95 if you're doing a good job with not only where you place your trail cameras and the locations and your trail cam setups, but also how you're linking those habitat improvements together, even if you're on public land scouting it, or if you're on private land and actually determining and building those habitat improvement features. And after you've identified, you have enough definition of movement, your trail cam locations to pick those areas up, you're getting 95% of your buck pictures. It all goes out the window if you have poor quality trail cameras. We've used Axis trail cameras. This will be actually the 5th hunting season that I will be using Exodus trail cameras. It's crazy that it's gone by. It's one of my favorites right here. It's Exodus Render. It's a high quality cell cam. And then we have our Lift 2s right here. I'm just putting a lot out. I have a new property that I'm going to own in Minnesota this year. And so I'm actually going out tomorrow early to stick a couple trail cameras out, maybe make a mock scrape or two. And it's early in the year for doing that, but I can't wait. And I know that we'll have a quality trail camera. And there's other quality trail cameras. I have not tried every trail camera out there, so I can't say that Exodus are the best, but I can say that I rely on them for my career. And not only my career, but my passion and love of all things whitetails. Pretty cool. Last year, one of the bucks that I shot was a random buck. And he was just coming through, and he was a 10-point, and we still haven't been able to locate him from the years past. I believe because we shot another mature buck out of there that another one slots in, and that's what happens a lot when you have high quality habitat features where you have a lot of definition and movement and the deer are safe, and especially those does and fawns that are hitting those food sources every day are consistent. Then you'll have various lines where a buck can fall into that line, slot into that line, and he will stick and stay, and then he goes right past your stand location. You get a chance. And that's where you can have those random bucks that come in and they slot into those movements when they come in. We had one of those last year. Not very common, but it does happen. And again, It goes back to, think about that 95% rule. Are you identifying 95% of the bucks that you take pictures of every year? No matter how few or how many that you have, make sure that you recognize those bucks, you keep a catalog of those bucks. Moving forwards, those unique bucks, really look for them, because it's not all about, yeah, he might be by its stand by a certain time. It's more about learning about the behavior of those bucks, learning where they might live on or off your property, which will determine when they come on your land. And I love trail cameras. Getting back to, that's why I can't wait to put them out tomorrow. I'm really excited, like kid in a candy store. You can imagine, with some new land, which we'll talk about in upcoming videos. But I just love getting them out. I'm going to put them on some new mock scrapes, and we'll see what happens. But you can bet they'll lead a lot to me going forward, and not only trying to recognize all those bucks, but see how I'm doing as a habitat manager, as a hunting manager, whether I'm hunting on public or private land, and seeing how I'm connecting the dots and if I'm doing a good job so far. Hey, if all else fails and you want to find a good spot, find a bunch of old signs, some old buck sign rubs and scrapes in the woods, and without thinking about anything else, always a good spot for a trail cam location, especially if it's remote. Find the history of sign. That's way more important than current sign. And that history of sign, often where you show years of buck use, will lead you on the path to a great hunt this fall.